Hello, everyone. Welcome again to the 2021 State of Memphis Housing Summit, and it's a pleasure to be here with you. For those of you who don't know me, my name is Imani Jasper. I was formerly the program manager with Neighborhood Preservation Inc., and I'm excited to be introducing your moderator and panelists for session 6, addressing blighted property at the root. So, as we all know, abandoned property continues to be one of the most challenging housing issues in our community, disproportionately impacting communities of color. There are new and growing systems in Memphis and cities like it designed to address the issue of blighted property at its root. And so, the impacts of blighted properties, whether it's their impact on housing markets, local and citywide, neighborhood appearance, community health, and its impact on the city budget. These are all wildly experienced in Memphis, from the house next door to those of us who may be working in City Hall. And resolving this blighted property problem cannot be solved with quick, simple fixes, because if it could, there wouldn't be a panel. Like, we could all just be doing something else right now. But it's going to require getting to the root of what these problems stem from and what systemic change needs to occur to improve our city. So, from landlord registries to homeowner rehab projects to programs to acquire and rehab blighted properties. This panel discussion is going to focus on solutions that address the root causes of blighted properties. You're going to hear from national abandoned property thought leaders, and you're also going to hear from those working on the ground in Memphis who are working to reuse abandoned properties intentionally and thoughtfully using the systems available. So I'm not going to take up too much of your time because you're not here to listen to me tell you about a problem you know exists. You're here to hear from our panelists. So I'm going to start by introducing our moderator today. And so I can tell she's as excited as you all are for this session to begin. It's my pleasure to introduce the moderator for this panel, Leslie Smith, Executive Director of the Blight Authority of Memphis. Leslie Smith is director of BAM, a quasi-governmental nonprofit entity authorized by the Memphis City Council. Through their mission, Ms. Smith collaborates with government officials, with private developers, and community leaders to convert vacant, abandoned, foreclosed, or tax delinquent properties into productive use, thus reducing blight, increasing property values, and improving the quality of life in Memphis neighborhoods. She's dedicated her life's work to dismantling systemic injustices at the root through building sustainable solutions to drive toward an economically sound future for tomorrow. Leslie, take it away.
Thank you for that, Imani. So as Imani just explained, I'm with the Blight Authority of Memphis. Really simple, we are a municipal land bank that was created underneath the statute of the Tennessee Local Land Bank 1330, which allows us to be able to serve as a community development intermediary to work with government and community leaders alike to transform blighted properties into economic opportunities in ways that either sides would be limited to. We work in areas where there's a lot of high concentration of vacant properties and distressed communities, and we work with government officials to take the stagnant properties as a source of addressing blight. And we also work with community leaders to identify opportunities for working to address blighted properties. And through working with both sides, we're able to work to put together at least a land assembly proposal for how we're able to convert these properties from blighted and back into productive use. And so we are in our early operational stages right now, but we've come a long way. We've had a strategic plan process that was made by Center for Community of Progress, who we also will have an opportunity to hear from later on. But this has truly been a very exciting experience because we've been able to engage with CDCs in the local Memphis market to really try to figure out what is it that they need in terms of land banking needs and vacant properties, and what ways that the land bank can use its statute to help them, empower them to address their blight elimination needs. And we were able to have that same conversations with neighborhood resident leaders and government officials. And so now we're in our operational stages. So we're building up our capacity. We are open for property sales and we're pushing along. But this is a conversation that was really kind of brought together because, we've got a lot of movement that's happening within the Memphis market. The land bank is one aspect, but it certainly isn't necessarily the whole picture for how we can address blight. And so it is my honor and privilege to be able to speak with some of the people that are kind of working locally on the ground, who I know very well, Jared Myers with the Heights CDC, and the great work he's doing in the Jackson neighborhood. And then also Brian Larkin from Center for Community Progress. What you may or may not know, Center for Community Progress is one of the national leaders of addressing vacant properties. They were also very instrumental in helping us to address vacant properties. I met Brian through the strategic planning process, and they were also launching a national land bank summit. They just announced the Reclaiming Vacant Properties conference that will be taking place next year. So if you definitely have more questions from this panel, that's definitely something for you to kind of look into. But speaking of which, bringing it back home, I want to get to what's happening locally on the ground. But first, I want to start off with Brian. Can you tell us a little bit about the great work that you guys are doing for Center for Community Progress? Tell us about yourself, and then also kind of just talk to us a little bit about the challenges that you see across the board happening in cities like Memphis, and how we are trying to address abandonment.
Thank you, Leslie. Thank you for that. I would be happy to. First and foremost, I just want to say thank you for all of you guys who are engaged in this work on the ground, making a difference, residents who are speaking up and advocating. I've had the opportunity over the past year to interact with many of the great folks in Memphis, and you guys are doing outstanding work. The summit has been amazing, from the mayor's morning to the sessions to the mid piece in the afternoon. I've really enjoyed it, and I think what probably the best part has been in the chat and the comments, and seeing all of the different ideas and how excited people are about keeping people in homes, keeping families in places, and restoring communities. And today's discussion is about one of those biggest challenges to sustaining communities, and that's vacant, abandoned, and deteriorated properties. And so what I want to do today, with a few little minutes that I have, is just frame the conversation from a national level on what is it we're exactly talking about, what are the tools that communities typically have when we come in to address them, and then as we segue into Jared, we can hear about really what's going on the ground. So at this time, I'm going to try to go ahead and share my screen. Let's see if we can do this. Not completely sure. All right, just a second. All right, just okay. We have to switch it just a second. It was overlapping with the same screen I was looking at, and that wouldn't work very well for any of us. All right. And there we go. All right. So really what I wanted to talk about today is some of the work that's going on. As Leslie mentioned, the Center for Community Progress, we are a national nonprofit that focuses on vacant, abandoned, and deteriorated properties. We've been working over a decade in communities throughout the country. We've been over 35 states and 300 different communities. Some of the premier issues that we address: land banking, land reuse policy, code enforcement, vacancy prevention. And so really excited that this National Land Bank Network is newly formed and working closely with partners like Leslie and the over 250 land bank leaders in the country to help provide them a national voice to help advocate for the field of land banking and the work that they're doing. I've been in this work since January of 2021. The National Land Bank Network was recently funded through generous nonprofit and philanthropic partners throughout the country who believe in the work that land banks are doing. And today's conversation is about everything that goes into place in advance of that. So looking at systemic vacancy. Systemic vacancy is the community experience of widespread property vacancy, and it's caused by these several actions. And one of the things that's so important to recognize with systemic vacancy is that it feeds itself. It sends these signals to the market that then perpetuates activities that further deteriorates the places, and it continues a vicious cycle. It starts with these equity challenges that then triggers the market to devalue properties. Then once those values are lowered, it disincentivizes investors from actually investing in the property. So they're stepping away. Now you're having more vacancy, which then creates more negative challenge for the people that are living there. And then more of these triggers. And it goes on and on and on. And what we are really focused in as an organization, and what this conversation is focused in, is breaking into that cycle, figuring out the ways to disrupt that process. So we talked about, you have that systemic vacant and abandoned deteriorated properties. What are the interventions? What's possible? And so we really focus on policies, practices, and processes. And these are what every community can really do in different and various forms, depending on your environment. One of the first things you want to do at the beginning is, when you're recognizing that you have vacancy, when you have abandoned properties, when you have deteriorated board structures, the number one thing you want is for those to just become revitalized. You would like our communities are best served when the people who are invested in them, our homeowners, our investors, are able to fix up the properties in which they're staying in. And so the first thing you'd like to happen, and the quickest thing, is to fix that problem property up. And we could most often get that through enhanced code enforcement activities. And again, one thing that is very important, it'll come across at the end, but I want to emphasize it right now, is all of these strategies need to be conducted with the lens of equity. And so equitable code enforcement. So code enforcement for the sake of enhancing the community in which we occupy, not for the purpose of being negative impacts to a disproportionate portion of the population. Really looking at code enforcement as a tool to support those who are there. In the cases where we can't get those owners to comply and improve upon that property, the next piece is, all right, well, what will it take to transition this property to a new owner? We're dealing with parcels that people have decided, you know what, we are not going to fix up. But in many communities and spaces, it's a challenge for what happens there. And what we look at there is, once the code enforcement process is really working in a fair and equitable fashion and an efficient way to support the community, then what does the property tax enforcement system looks like? Is it a system where once you don't pay your taxes on it and you don't do anything with it and you don't fix it up, that it just languishes, further spreading vacancy and blight throughout your neighborhoods? If so, those are systems that can be improved. When you have a system of code enforcement that works, when you have a delinquent tax enforcement system that supports getting properties that people are no longer interested in off the rolls, then you need a place that can temporarily hold and maintain this property. You need a place that is easily accessible. You need a place that has the powers to intervene in that space and to get a hold of this property. That's where the Blight Authority of Memphis comes in, and that's where the land banks across the country come in. Land banks are the vehicle that can hold these properties and maintain them in a way that allows all of our different partners that wouldn't be able to be involved before get involved in this. This is where your nonprofits are able to get hold of the property. This is where some of your small investors and small developers are able to participate in the system in a way that they couldn't before when it was caught up in the system. If you couldn't get owner compliance, if the properties were stuck in tax limbo, and then if you didn't have a way to access it, the only people who are able to really interject in that property are cash buyers who may have less of an interest in what's going on in our local community. So that's where land banks come in to really support that. And then at the end, getting it back to a productive use. We want to sustain, reuse, and provide community benefit. There are several different aspects that help for that. There's property reuse, there's our planning and zoning strategies, there's different partnerships, but all of these pieces together really lead towards the outcomes that we're looking for, where vacant, abandoned, deteriorated properties become vibrant solutions for our communities. And so that's the piece that I just wanted to stretch as we talk about these issues in any community. And as we transition now to Jared, he'll be able to really be more tangible and on the ground about some of the things that we're seeing directly here in Memphis.
Thanks, Brian. Yeah, I really appreciate what you said about equitable code enforcement. I think we have a long way to go here in Memphis with just a culture of code enforcement and how people in our communities view it. There needs to be more, I think, carrots than sticks in a lot of cases. How do we meet people where they're at, with trying to address their properties that they own or maybe they inherited. So I'm going to try to share my screen as well. Maybe I can figure this out too. Let's see. Not that one. Brian, what was your trick on this? Did you have it open in a different tab there?
So what I did, I was trying to do a PowerPoint, and my challenge was that the screen he wanted to show it on was the same screen I was looking at, and so I had to make it show on I was using 2 monitors, so I made sure that the PowerPoint was in the left one. But if you want to do it all here, if you're working on one screen, I think when you share, the screen will come up and it'll say which screen you want to share.
All right, it's not showing that one. Maybe there's an option to unpin this one and choose a different one.
Well, while Jared is taking the time to bring that up, I just wanted to remind the audience, if you have any questions, I know we just heard a presentation from Brian who gave us a lot of really thought conversations. So please remember to type your questions in the chat and we'll pull them later on.
I'm really sorry I don't have the visuals figured out here. Maybe there's someone in the chat who can help me, or
are you sharing a presentation or one of the tabs out of your browser?
I was trying to show a presentation. Maybe I can just open.
Yeah, I think if you
do that,
if you open it now and put it on your full screen, it'll you just won't be able to see us, but you'll see the presentation and go all the way, and we'll see it. If your full screen was just your presentation right now, we would see it.
Okay, let me try that. Are y'all seeing that now?
Yep. Yeah, we can see it perfectly fine, and just we can see it even though you can't see us.
All right. Well, thanks, Brian, for helping me navigate that. So we have a saying in our neighborhood, we rise by lifting others, and I think it's something that we've bought into recently. Our neighborhoods of Highland Heights, Mitchell Heights, and Graham Heights kind of encompass this area of Memphis. It's 2 square miles where we have over 11 vacant and abandoned properties. 1,100 vacant and abandoned properties. So there's a huge challenge in this. Our organization is pretty young. We were incubated by Binghamton Development Corporation, who has done some great work to the southwest of us in addressing blight, learning from them, learning from other CDCs around the city, and peer organizations around the country. This is something that y'all have seen as well. So it kind of shows our area median income, household income, the sea of poverty, I guess, for some of you who are not familiar with how this relates to housing, but then also a map of demographics of our city. These are where Latino families are concentrating and moving into our community. I'm sorry, there's not a map bar to kind of show you the density of this, but we realize our neighborhood is growing more and more diverse, with more and more Latino neighbors moving in, which we love. And they bring all of the aspects of the culture to our community, including the great food, even the housing background experience of being able to work on a lot of our housing. So we've really seen some changes. This is our high school graduation attainment rate. This is our ACT scores. I show all this because it does relate to housing in a number of ways. This is our, not a weather map, although it is raining here in Memphis and in the neighborhood as I look out the window. This is a crime map, okay? And then this is a vacancy map. So if you look at both of these back and forth, you notice that where we have high rates of vacancy in our community, we have high rates of crime. So in order to address what you see here, blighted properties that are being used for illegal activity, they make people feel unsafe, they contribute to negative health outcomes and mental health outcomes. We've been able to purchase and rehab 10 of these homes, now working on our 11th and 12th. We do this with residents. We do our best to promote home ownership if that's an option that they want to pursue. We recently sold 2 months ago, sold our first house to someone who had been renting to us for 3 years. And we're happy and excited about that. So obviously what Brian said about just finding the owners is a big key to this. So this house that you see behind you here, I believe the owner was out of Missouri. Tracking these people down you almost become like a detective. And I think one of the tools I would like for folks who are viewing this to take away is that you can go onto the assessor's website, and I'll try, or maybe Leslie, she's able to drop this in the chat since I can't switch screens, but go to the assessor's website and find out who the property owner is. And then start to do some searching of who they are. Maybe you can get in contact with them and ask them, what is your interest in the property? If you're from out of town, or if you're from in town, is there something that maybe you as an individual or as an organization can do to help remediate the blight instead of calling code enforcement first? I think we're in a society now where we realize it's not always best to do that. It's not always best to call any kind of enforcement to come to the scene. Let's call them directly and see if there's any way we can participate in helping them remediate the blight. What you're seeing now are some pictures from a spring break board up project that we've been doing. We haven't been able to do it the last 2 years, but for 5 consecutive years, we boarded up over 30 vacant houses with some art. These are students from our neighborhood who got to learn how to use power tools for the first time, have some artistic license to be able to take these, go into the community and ask residents what they want to see. Maybe some of the residents asked to see some inspirational quotes. They wanted a kind of a monochromatic theme, kind of what you see here, to make it look like there's actually windows. Another way to address blight is through art. With the art of the spring break board up, transitioning into a fence and a wall that was blighted with graffiti. So we worked with the local artist, Tunekey Berry, who you see there in the bottom right. An amazing artist. He's become too cool for us now. I feel like he's just blown up, but we take pride in this is his first outdoor mural, and a huge one to scale. It's about 111 feet long and about 12 to 15 feet high. But it says Heights, incorporating all of our neighborhoods' names: Mitchell Heights, Highland Heights, and Graham Heights, and even Brinkley Heights that's in there as well. And this is right across the street from a school. So if you have this dilapidated, I wish there was a before picture of what the fence and the wall looked like before, being very, riddled with graffiti, different patches of paint to cover the graffiti, just a big eyesore. And then adjacent to this, to the north, was a blighted house, and that was one of the houses the Heights CDC was able to acquire from a property owner, again, out of town, tracking them down and then being able to make that transition into a productive reuse, as what Brian had mentioned. Here's a pocket park. This is another reuse of a blighted piece of property. On this property at Pope and Faxon, there was an old burned down house that was used for criminal activity. The neighborhood had asked for some help. So these are some leftover planter boxes from a demonstration project that the Heights CDC did on National Street called the Heights Line. I'm going to share something. This is another fun story. It's not related to housing property, but it is related to our neighborhood. So Treadwell High School closed in 2008. And when it did, it left a void in our neighborhood. Our identity kind of around this guy, Elliot Perry and Penny Hardaway. Basketball is a big part of our culture. And there's Penny. He came back to the school recently. We did a court dedication. This was a blighted basketball court. And we're talking about changing blight from housing, vacant lots. But there's also park spaces and unused spaces in our community. You can find blight in all different areas of your neighborhood if you look close enough. And some neighborhoods, you don't have to look hard at all. And in this area, we were able to take this blighted court, one that was not being used, and there was nothing out here, and rehab it. So, and this is an older picture as well. The court is somewhat faded and pink after 4 years. But this was a fun project. We were able to use IOB. So that's another tool I'd like to leave y'all with. IOB stands for In Our Backyard, and they are a crowdsourcing website that you can go to, create a project for your neighborhood, like a pocket park or a garden, or even like a board up project. We used IOB for that as well, to raise money from people in our community and then from people from outside of our neighborhood who wanted to invest in a project like this. This project, the basketball court, was about a $14,000 lift for us. a lot of the majority of the money that for this project came from the neighborhood, and we're really excited about that as well. So that's all I really had. I really want this to be more of a discussion. I think we talked about that, being able to share about the different projects that we've done here in Memphis, and again, can't reiterate enough. There's so many options to engage with Clean Memphis. And with Memphis City Beautiful, they have tool banks and things that will help you. The Heights CDC has a tool bank. We loan out tools to residents in our neighborhood to help address blighted properties, to get people into compliance. And I think the last thing I do want to share is a narrative or a story about when I realized that Memphis was in the right direction when it comes to addressing blight is when I got a phone call from environmental court. James Cameron was on the other line, and he said, "Hey, there's a resident, a neighbor of yours in your neighborhood that needs some help. He's in environmental court right now. He's a veteran. He's taking care of his grandson that goes to Treadwell, where our offices are." And I was like, well, this is great. Like, the court is calling us to help remediate an issue. We were able to get some volunteers and some residents together to help address it, so that he would be in compliance with code. And he also got to meet some neighbors. And I think that was a huge win for us that happened. And I hope that happens more often, right? That code enforcement and the environmental court can make those phone calls and make those connections to neighborhoods so that we can address properties with property owners that are here that may just need some help. So anyway, I'll turn it back over to you, Leslie, to help moderate the conversation.
Thank you for that. So I know we heard a lot about, like, overall from a national perspective, what are some kind of, overarching themes that we kind of see. And we were able to kind of take from that conversation and kind of hear about some resources that we have kind of in place on the ground, working either through land banking or working and engaging with our code enforcement, and even just the powerful work that our CDCs brings to offer. One thing that was mentioned a lot was equitable code enforcement. And someone had mentioned that, we should have like a working definition of that. And so I want to at least kind of kick things off by just like really honing in on that. What is your definition of what equitable code enforcement? What does that look like?
I suppose I should take that first since I threw that in the conversation. I think it takes each community to kind of define how you execute and accomplish those goals and what it looks like. But we can start with what inequitable code enforcement is. So inequitable code enforcement is code enforcement that is its end goals is that of compliance outside of impact on community. And so recognizing that code enforcement is there to accomplish the building codes that exist are there to accomplish a form of safety. But there are other housing policy goals that need to be weighed in as well, and code enforcement as a tool for that. So for example, an equitable code enforcement strategy is one that prioritizes safety, but also looks at the creation and preservation of affordable units, the stability of housing, allowing people to age securely in place, and stabilize and strengthen neighborhoods. That last piece is really important. And so taking all those into context together, decision-making will, take all of that into account. So while safety is absolutely important, and we want to make sure that people are living in safe places, when the execution of code enforcement is just for the compliance of the books in and of itself, with no regard of what it's done to the neighborhoods and the conditions of the neighborhoods, and it actually makes our neighborhoods worse and less stable, then that's inequitable. And so I think we can recognize that, please, and building towards equitable code enforcement is based on the overarching community strategies. And I think it should be somewhat locally defined.
I agree with that. Jared, can you take a stab from a neighborhood perspective?
Yeah, I mean, I agree with Brian. It needs to be local because every neighborhood is different. Every neighborhood has different needs, and the language of every neighborhood is different, right? And understanding that, I mentioned the culture of our community is changing. And with the Latino neighbors that are coming in, my new neighbors that are here may not know what the code is, the UDC, right? Like what is that? Like who there are people who are who've lived there their whole life who have no idea what the Unified Development Code is, right? So being able to educate our neighbors and speak the same language, and then also understand when new neighbors come here from other countries, they're bringing the culture with them that they have, and the understanding of, for our community specifically, it's around fences and walls, right? So in my neighbors who are coming from Latin America, from Central America, back home, they're used to having walls and fences around their properties, right? It makes them feel safer. It's a matter of establishing, this is mine, that I've built up. But sometimes these walls and fences, they can actually cause problems to line of sight for people walking or driving. They can, make our neighborhood feel less cohesive, right? So it's kind of just educating them and just saying, hey, like, we totally understand. Like, if you have safety concerns, let's figure this out. And then if there's an issue with the fence height, like at the front of the house, if it's over 4 feet, having a conversation with them before they have to have a negative or any kind of interaction with code enforcement and say, hey, let's save a lot of money on your fence project by just knowing ahead of time it's going to need to be 4 feet on the front. That way that they're not upset, there's not a negative, if the first meeting you have with someone is a negative one, that's not good either. So we've been working hard to identify when we see those fences going up and they're not to code, is to, in my broken Spanish, try to explain to them, this is going to cost money down the road, or we can try to do it the right way. And there are very few times where it hasn't worked out to where they're just very appreciative that someone would help them kind of, as a new neighbor, be welcome, and why we do that. Explain why do we have these codes of 4-foot fences on the front of the property. So I don't know if that answered you directly, Leslie. I was just kind of sharing a narrative there.
I think it does paint a picture. So when we talk about, equitable code enforcement, you tend to kind of give the academic answer, but I feel like what you were able to provide was an equitable example. And I think that that's very important for, providing a demonstration or a visual image to really convey the level of considerations that needs to be taken into place to achieve that. Along those same lines, there was something that you mentioned at the beginning of your introduction, Jared. You mentioned that in this industry, a lot of times what you have is you have a lot of issues, but you don't have a lot of carrots. I don't remember the phrase exactly, but it was along those lines, I guess. But, we've got a need. We know the clear need. There's reports. There's a lot of news articles. We're oversaturated with the issues that we have. It may not be current, but we do know we have some opportunities to address and turn Blight around. But sometimes we may not be aware of, some of the things that are needed to get us over the hump and able to address those issues. And so I'm kind of curious. I want to hit you, Brian, first to see on a national scale, what are some things that are missing right now, that if it was implemented in some kind of legislation or political, it would help to really kind of remove a lot of barriers in addressing Blight. And then Jared, if you could kind of hop in and, what you've noticed kind of locally and what that might look like in terms of what needs are needed to have.
Well, I would say the number one barrier is, the number one thing that could be done at the national and federal level is provide more resources. Ultimately, give more dollars to the communities, to the people on the ground that are doing the place. But to give some more context to that, so for instance, in Memphis, with the Blight Authority of Memphis, you guys have a lot of amazing tools that you can help hold property that nonprofits may not. Some of your nonprofit developers may say, "Oh, I'd love to work with that lot right there or that house right there, and we could fix it up." We'd have to do fundraising. It's going to take a couple of years. We can't pay the holding costs. We can't acquire the title. The Blight Authority of Memphis has a way to do that inexpensively, but not for free. right? And there are not enough dollars in the communities to support these ways that, support communities. So having those pieces in place. One of the big things though, just and that's looking locally. So for everyone who's thinking about like locally, what are the things? I think federally, providing resources to the systems that are already in place. There are bills that have been introduced in Congress over the past 12 to 18 months that get at various forms of doing that. We have some bills that the National Land Bank Network is supporting that look at providing technical assistance to associations, to organizations. There are some bills that encourage local governments and nonprofits and land banks to work together to partner to apply for competitive grants. And so these are the pieces that we really are pushing. If any of you have heard, I'm sure people have heard, but if any of you are paying attention to what's going on with the infrastructure bill, there has been a big, kind of tug and war back and forth. And one of the things that we are really pushing for is saying housing is a pivotal part of infrastructure. If we're going to build back better, as they're calling it, you have to build your communities back, and resources that look to help with the physical infrastructure, to help with affordability, to help with the traction and putting those pieces together. Because if we don't, the challenge that we come to is that these communities will revitalize. I have no doubt, and that you all have no doubt as well, that the concern is not that, oh no, nothing is ever going to happen with these places. The concern is that the people who have spent the time here, the residents, those who have invested and rolled out the good and the bad, will not be able to partake in when it's coming around on the other end. And that's what federal resources do. We make sure that the priorities of the community are there in place. What I would say from a larger kind of national lens as well is putting in places as I mentioned that when I showed the circle at the beginning, that quadrant about tax enforcement, having efficient tax enforcement systems. There are some places where it can be stuck for years and years. You live right next door to a house that is just a disrepair and got rodents are coming out, and you've got enough money to do something about it and help, but you can't get a hold of it because it's got 8 different owners and out of state and is caught up in levels of court. So that needs to be cleared across the board. That is one of the things that we need a clear and sensible tax enforcement system that we can get these properties into productive hands. And when those systems are in place, and when you have land banks like you do here in Memphis, then we need to provide resources to them to do the good work. It's not good enough to put a land bank in place and say, all right, make do with what everyone has walked away from. It's saying, let's provide you with these powers and these resources to accomplish the community's goals.
Okay,
Yep.
I didn't pay him to say that. That was that was something that was very needed. And before you go, Jared, I just wanted to kind of stress in on something that you mentioned in your example about properties that are in the the property and code enforcement process. There is a lot of resources that are here, and I think there was something mentioned in the chat I would like to kind of touch on later on. But the environmental court, there's the Neighborhood Preservation Act, where there's a lot of properties that are ended up stuck into that system awaiting for a receiver. And so definitely want to make sure that you are aware of that. That does happen. And I'm pretty sure that if you reach out to one of our attendees, I think she'll be more than happy to provide you with information to learn about how to participate in the receivership program. But I definitely I wanted to acknowledge that comment, and also catch it at the tail end because that was relevant. But carry on, Jared.
Yeah, thanks, Leslie. And Brian, I would say too, I agree with you on the tax enforcement policies that need to be examined at every state level. I know every state has a different way that they deal with delinquent property taxes. So in the state of Tennessee, I know that the debt owed to a county or municipality cannot be sold, right? And I recently learned in the Commonwealth of Kentucky, our neighbors to the north, there are opportunities for counties to sell that bad debt, right? So that's an instant way to recoup those taxes, and it's a way for you to possibly hasten or quicken the transition of a blighted property, right? If we know the debt is going to get paid, there's even more people being invested in having that property become useful again, right, for becoming a home. So I think like we should, talk to our state legislators, like talk to our state officials and say, hey, is this something that we're exploring? Are there positives and negatives to this? And Brian, you probably know more about that aspect of it, but I just think that we're limiting ourselves if we're not looking at all of the options on the table when it comes to tax enforcement policies. I don't deal with a lot of that at the neighborhood level. I wanted to share about, Leslie asked what's missing when it comes to policies. I think that there needs to be a connection of the policies around housing, but also in public works. And because I think that when we talk about sanitation, when we talk about the cleanliness of neighborhoods, the walkability of neighborhoods, blight is related to all of that. When you walk through a neighborhood that you feel is blighted, it's not just about the vacant house with a broken window or the open door. It's not just about that. It's about the trash cans that are blocking the sidewalk, or the sidewalks that don't exist, they're overgrown or broken. Or it has to deal with eviction piles that are up, piled up really high that are left out there for weeks on end. So these policies on how we address sanitation, bulk pickup outside the cart, that really does tie really closely into how we're addressing blighted properties. And I think part of it too is holding property owners accountable, right? But doing it in an equitable way, making sure that people, like, if we started to change policies around sanitation and around bulk pickup, that I believe has a strong impact on our neighborhood, and something that our organization is working on with trying to make our neighborhood more walkable and friendly and clean, that you feel differently when you walk through our community. I think that we have to look at strategies and changing how we do that in an equitable way, where people aren't, burdened with an extra cost, right? If they have to get rid of a couch for whatever reason, for them to have to pay more money. So anyway, that's something else that we're looking at. I think there's a missing connection between all our policies and how we're viewing blight, right? There for a long time we just see blight as housing, but I think we need to think beyond that.
Man, so yeah, I don't think I could have said that better myself. The scale and range of ways to address blight is probably even larger than we can actually even, merit for this particular workshop session. And there are a lot of players and resources in that industry that make up a part of that ecosystem. And it's going to be CDCs like you that are on the ground, along with partners that are nationally supporting us on the advocacy level in order to help us to kind of continue to promote that, keep that front in mind of a lot of our legislators. There are some of our in designing these sessions, there's a lot of people that could be on this panel that would be really great to have. I do know that there are some people Memphis City Beautiful, Clean Memphis, Neighborhood Preservation Inc. And they have already been kind of thinking on these conversations and already created programs to kind of help provide some innovative ways to activate vacant properties, or different ways to go about looking at doing neighborhood cleanups. And so definitely, if you're interested in learning more about that, definitely put that in the chat, and I'll try to see if I can kind of connect with you on that later on the back end of that. But there was a question that was placed in the chat that I really wanted to kind of get you guys to react to. So there are a lot of everybody's moving virtual. A lot of some of our properties that ended up being sold by government is going and being conducted on internet. So it's really easy to buy properties in Memphis and not live in the state, not have any stake, and also not even be able to kind of touch and see the people that your property is affecting the neighbors. And so I wanted to see, perceived or not, real or reality or not, if this is what this looks like for you all. What is it? It feels like it could be happening a lot in Memphis, but is it really happening? Do you see this even in the Jackson area, Jared? And then on a national scale, is there a trend where this is happening? And then kind of what your thoughts on how we can potentially look to secure maybe some local site control approaches, like land trusts.
I'll start on this one, Brian, if you don't mind. I think that, the out of town stuff is tough for me because, even accountability is a big issue. Currently would love to have conversations more with the trustee's office who facilitates the tax sales, right? And you're right. Anyone with an internet connection can buy a piece of property in Memphis, if they have the resources to do it, and they don't necessarily have to disclose who they are. That's frustrating, right? Like, one, there's a disconnectedness in neighborhoods, right? If you don't know who your neighbor is, and it also makes it difficult to have equitable code enforcement. If you can't even identify who you're supposed to be having a relationship with to talk to get them into compliance to be a good property owner and be a good neighbor. That can be an easy policy change. Everyone who signs up for Civic Source to buy a property from the county has to have a real estate agent that's registered here and listed here in the state of Tennessee or in Shelby County. That should not be very difficult for an investor to do. And it's a simple requirement. It's not a barrier. We're not going to lose out on income from the tax sale because of that. Most of these guys have an investor here or a real estate agent here locally anyway. But it just is another accountability measure that we need to act. I did not say this at the beginning. I'm glad I'm not the first person to say it, but someone said a landlord registry or a rental registry. I think that is another great policy that could happen that helps us to address these out of town owners. So I'll leave it at that, Brian. I know you've got some other ideas that are being used at the national level, but locally, that's what I would like to see.
Yeah, I mean, I think it's important that we this is a reoccurring issue, throughout the country and communities everywhere. And I think it's important that we identify what that specific issue is, and we're talking about it here. It's that lack of attention, lack of scale and investment. So oftentimes the conversation we'll hear with communities are, well, I'm going to lose the dollars. I've got an investor that's willing to pay. But research and studies have shown that down the line ends up costing you more because of the lack of investment over time, because of the conditions of it. Those conditions spread. We have our conversations about property and places as a transaction, as if it's, one house, one lot, but it's all connected, and once you're allowing poor conditions to occur or a lack of standards to uphold that start spreading to other places, and that value comes off of your community as a whole. And also we've seen that local community related investors are more likely to put more into their property. They're likely to keep the values of it up. So looking just from a dollars and cents point, the argument is made that there should be a prioritization placed on local. That is not to say there should be exclusions, as Jerry mentioned. Like, no one is saying no prohibition by any stretch, but if you're going to be doing it, there's some other requirements. One of the greatest tools to addressing this, and this will be no surprise to anyone, I am one trick pony here. Land banks as a vehicle can acquire properties for cheaper. They can enter into the tax foreclosure system. And when you're working closely with your county trustees and in other states' treasurers, and there's an understanding of the powers and resources are there, we can get properties on the front end that are then prepared. You can look at your communities. You can see, I can ask anyone, there are 43 people in the conversation right now. I am positive I can ask any one of you, where are the areas that are most likely gentrifying, that have recently occurred, or where it's happening. But when you already know those areas have properties that are in the delinquent tax foreclosure system. This is the pipeline of properties that land banks can get a hold of, that they can get a hold of before the investors, that they can get a hold of at a rate that is supportive to the community. So it's a superpower. It really, really is. I mean, the Blight Authority of Memphis is a untapped fountain of resources to support in issues such as this. And every land bank throughout the country is not exactly the same. You get your powers from state statute. And so what I'm talking about today is specific to what you can do. We think this is the kind of the best way to engage in that place. But imagine that if you said, hey, in this area, this neighborhood, we want to make sure that any property that's in the delinquent tax foreclosure system is able to be into community equitable development opportunities. That's more access for parcels for affordable housing. That's decreasing the cost that it is for the construction and the development, which then decreases the rates in which the people that can come in there. I mean, you know it all, you have it there, the resources are there, but it takes some time to deal with. This is a new way of working. I mean, land banking as a field is really had a surge in the past decade, and real estate as a field is around since the beginning of time. And so this is a new way of thinking and learning, but I think it is an amazing tool if the community goals are aligned with supporting getting local investing, local owners, and local community buy-in.
Hey, Leslie, I think we're going to have to get you a superhero cape. I think that's what Brian was trying to say, is like, we'll find a cape or something for you to put on. It should match or something. I think with a BAM shield on the back, I've already got, it's like your Halloween costume is already planned out.
Oh my God. I literally was just talking about that with me, but for BAM, because a lot of the work, it cannot be done by just the land banks alone. It's the partners that we have. It's the people that are on this call that are compelled to be able to be volunteers or small scale developers. It's going to be the resource agencies that we work with and the government officials, and give them all capes, be Oprah style with it. So that's something to be continued, but this has been such a very good conversation. And I feel like it's such a very, dense conversation that literally deserves probably another type of conversation. This was not supposed to be about land banks. And so there will be some upcoming workshops where we will be on our own hosting workshops. And so maybe we can continue to have those conversations. We definitely want to work with you if you're having these, if you have a proposal. I think that, we are also able to be a receiver through the NPA process. So, if you're interested in working through the environmental court and you need a land banking partner, definitely consider us for that, in addition to tax sales and properties that you are wanting to hold. But be that as it may, we've talked about a lot. We want to know what this conversation meant to you. Was this a good conversation? Is this a conversation you need to see more of? What would you like to see in terms of like a focal point on how we address blight in these future sessions? Please be sure to let us know. I think one of the organizers told you where to put that. I have not figured out how to use the poll, but I'm pretty sure you guys want us to do this.
Yeah, it's right next to the chat. And yeah, it's definitely helpful to have feedback. And I know HCD wants it. All right, there were two things. I know there was a question I wanted to try to answer because I've got some thoughts on the Mo to Own program. And I don't know how much time we have left. But the other thing I would say, too, with Brian and Leslie's work on land banking, another idea of a policy change is like the HUD housing that is available. There's not a lot left in the portfolio of Memphis. But when for whatever reason, HUD, the federal government, acquires or has access to properties that have gone through foreclosure, they give a first right of refusal to nurses, teachers, police officers, a group of people, right? And I feel like if that's a federal policy, it could be easily turned into a state policy to where we're able to give who I would want as a neighbor. I'd love to have, a nurse as a neighbor, or have teachers, that live in our community, teach in our community. I think it would be a great opportunity for us to have those types of first right of refusal, or first option to purchase, I guess would be, first option to purchase would be a cool thing to do. But again, I don't know, Brian, the state legislature doesn't always work in the favor of the policies that we want to try to enact. With the Mo to Own program, yeah, I don't think Mo to Own is still happening, and I don't think it was very successful with how it was run, and I don't know why. But I do think that there needs to be more work from community development corporations to people who want to and who are currently taking care of adjacent properties to help them track down the owners and get that property into the hands of to the adjacent property owners. I know that is like something that I've been trying to work on with a resident here who has a community garden. The owners in Maryland, the tax debt is like 10 grand on the property. We're hoping that maybe it'll go through a tax sale and then eventually end up in a land bank. But it is tough. I do believe the Mo to Own program is good in theory, but how it's run is really important. And I think they should. I think it was like $25 goes towards the taxes. I think they should raise that to $100 for every time you mow it, because it takes a lot of work, especially if the property's been blighted for a while to get it mowed. So I love the questions we're getting, though. Some good stuff.
Man, you hear that, organizer? We might need to have a part 2 and maybe featuring the capes in person. So I also wanted to add, what I've seen, we're Blight Authority, and so we get a lot of questions that are outside our land banking capacity. But in summary, what I see a lot is the mow to own program kind of carried out in spirit on privately owned property that's not through the mow to own program. And so I do know it is hard to kind of live next to a property where their properties are affecting your properties. But please allow the code and tax enforcement system to do its place. Because what I've seen is, while properties might be eligible to go through the redemption period after it sells through the tax sale process, if there were code violations that were reported and unresolved, because people have taken it upon themselves to actually mow the grass, they were never able to capture the fact that there's a vacant and abandoned piece associated with that property. So it would take longer for it to be redeemed. And so I do think there needs to be additional teaching and learnings about that. We also need, if we're looking to have something of the sort that would bring back the mow to own program, I definitely think that's something that's not entirely out of the question. If we're wanting to look at something for mow to own, we would definitely have to own the property in order to give that property away, but we'd have to clean the title a little bit so that you're able to do something with the property that you're mowing. And so in order to do that, we have to be able to afford financing said things and the community engagement and outreach with that process. So definitely talk to your legislators, the legislators in the state, Senate, House of Representatives, and your city council and county commission, and let them know that this is something that's important to you. And because you're in their district, this is why it should be important for them. Well, we have 3 more minutes left on the call. I do believe I've tried to address and making sure that everyone's questions are heard, but last call for questions before we wrap up this session.
And I just want to make a note that there's some really good information in the chat there. So there's links both from the panelists here, but also from people in there. So there's some really good information. If you came in a little later, please scroll back there. Good links, emails, contact information for great programs in the community.
Yeah, thank you for bringing that up, Marissa. And so one of the ways that, the land banks offer support is, filing bulk quiet action title. It's definitely a way, but not necessarily a guaranteed way. So that may be a policy workup that we might need to work on. But we have 2 more minutes. Panelists, if you would to just kind of share one small phrase to kind of sum up the work that you do and any kind of last minute kind of questions you may have want to address from anything on the session, shoot.
Yeah, I would just say for Memphians listening and those who aren't from here, get invested in your neighborhood. Start small. Address blight by picking up litter. I mean, it's not difficult to do. By contacting the resources we have, by it really is small, and then learning who your neighbors are. I think that's such a novel thing these days, but we've gotten away from it. And then finding out too if there's a vacant lot on your block, or maybe of a relative that has one on their block, talking to them and their neighbors about what they would like to see. And then lean on this community development corporations. Building Memphis is an organization that I think that folks should know about. They have a lot of great folks working there that have great resources. But just start small, start somewhere, and then get to know your neighbors. I guess those would be the 2 that I would share.
Yeah, and in a couple of seconds, I agree completely with Jared. In addition to that, never underestimate the transformative power of the built environment. The things you see, how you feel, it really impacts, and especially when we think about our next generations. It impacts what we think people think of us in the communities and spaces. So when you pick that trash up, it's not just about cleaning that space. It's about what you're communicating about your community and home and your values and kind of how you want to be treated and how you want your space to live. And I mean, it's just so powerful and impacts the messages that we send throughout. So, never stop with all of the great work that you all are doing. And thank you guys for having me.
Well, thank you so much. That wraps up this session. Thank you for joining us for today's session. And enjoy your week.